4, right? Maybe 5. None of my kids had one chicken pox. When I was a kid, everyone had it. It was like your tonsils, your teeth. Yeah. Nobody, I'm like, I just never got it. That's weird.
Everyone's hearing your medical history.
They didn't have a vaccine until the early 80s. Yeah.
That's the medical report from Rebecca.
Yes. Now John's going to start his sermon, and we're all going to make fun of him too.
Yeah, this is Sunday school.
It's all the same. We're talking about clothes still.
Okay, we're back in Genesis. Well, we're in chapter 11 today. We're starting chapter 11. The topic is the Tower of Babel. But last week we studied Genesis 10, verses 8 through 12 about Nimrod. And here's those verses. Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Resen, between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city. So Cush, he is the son of Ham, whose people mostly migrated south into Africa, including Ethiopia and Libya and Morocco, and became a strong African kingdom. But a few of Cush's sons stayed in southern Saudi Arabia along the coastline and in Palestine, Canaan, Philistia, and even Tyre and Sidon. So a few of them stayed along the water there. But Nimrod apparently, okay, you're getting texts and they're dinging. Yeah, I'll keep talking if I can find where I was. But Nimrod apparently came up from Saudi Arabia and took over Babylon. It says he founded it. And basically when it says the land of Shinar, it means everything between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So his empire eventually stretched quite a ways from the Persian Gulf, which may have been a lot larger at the time. We believe, and we'll talk about next week, the Ice Age, that when the Ice Age came and a lot of the water froze, the sea levels dropped. And so the Persian Gulf went farther away. So at this point, the Persian Gulf is farther north. But anyway, Nimrod is the only character mentioned with extra details between Noah and Abram. And those are the two key characters in the first half of Genesis. Noah's story ends in Genesis 9, and Abram's story starts in Genesis 11. So Nimrod, the only guy in chapter 10 who has much press. But in Hebrew, Nimrod means rebel. It could be a nickname. It's probably not his real name, or perhaps it's part of his real name. But it tends to imply that he was a bad seed already. So either Nimrod was bad from the start, or he started good and ended bad. Some people suggest that Nimrod was a great hunter and was doing God's will by killing dangerous animals, maybe even dinosaurs or saber-toothed tigers and those sorts of things, to protect people. That's because after the flood, all of those creatures came out of the ark. And perhaps for a while, they were able to breed and spread. However, we believe that during the Ice Age, especially the dinosaurs all died off because they couldn't handle the cold. You know, reptiles, especially big ones, they don't have enough food to eat in cold weather and don't have enough energy. But anyway, so some people say he was a good hunter, and that's why it says he was a hunter before the Lord. But as I've told you, in Hebrew, prepositions are very difficult to interpret. And it can mean before the Lord, it can mean against the Lord, it can mean in the Lord, for the Lord, among the Lord. So deciding that it means something good is an interpretive thing. I think it's more likely that he was against the Lord, because he is the guy given credit here for building the two first evil kingdoms of earth, Babylon and Nineveh, the Assyrian Empire. And he stole that land from Shem. Perhaps it has been suggested that Nimrod, his father Cush, had a very angry temper about Noah's curse. Noah cursed his father Ham and his brother Canaan. Well, he didn't curse Ham, but he cursed his brother Canaan. And so perhaps he wanted revenge on the Shemites, because the Shemites were supposed to be the seed of the Messiah. So he decided to kill as many Shemites as he could. So it is quite possible that it says, not that he was a hunter, that he was a killer or a slaughterer. before the Lord. All the other times in the Bible when it talks about hunters, it says they hunted game, or they hunted small animals, or they hunted this animal or that animal. Here it doesn't say anything about what animals. And since it only talks about him building cities, the thought is that he was a slaughterer of men, that perhaps he killed lots of people building his empires. One translation is, oh, by the way, another thing is Jewish rabbis thought that Nimrod was one of the giants like the Nephilim, and his descendants could have been some of those Anakim, those giants. And Nimrod bragged, supposedly, about his wife who helped him to produce these giants. In fact, one of the theories is that the Tower of Babel was sort of Nimrod and his wife's sex shrine where they produced their more giants to take over the land. That's just one possibility. But here's one translation. Now, Cush sired Nimrod. He acted irreverently in order to become powerful on the earth. He became a powerful slaughterer in the sight of God. And many translations use the word mighty, but again, that's only one possibility. The other meaning of mighty is profane, evil, or irreverent. So there's a number of assumptions that the translators made. They tried to make him sound good, but it's possible that he was bad. And I suggest that he's probably bad. There are a few reasons to believe that Nimrod was the leader at the Tower of Babel. One reason is that Nimrod is the only man given extra details in Genesis 10, and then the next chapter is about the Tower of Babel. Secondly, Genesis 10:9 says that Nimrod started the cities of Babylon, and 10:10 says that Nimrod built Nineveh and the Assyrian cities. In Genesis 11, when it says, let us build a city and a tower, it's the same word. So Nimrod built, and now these guys say, let's build. That seems to be another probable connection. I mean, we're already talking about somebody who's building cities, and now they're building a city. So why wouldn't you think Nimrod was involved? So I don't have any doubt that Nimrod was the guy in charge. But what seems to have happened is that when God disrupts the Tower of Babel, which we'll see later, then he moves northwest to conquer Nineveh. The sons of Arphaxad from Shem retook Babylon when Nimrod fled. So Nimrod ruled Babylon for a little while, and then the tower failed, and then the Shemites moved back in and kicked him out, and he moved north and built Assyria, stealing it from Arphaxad. And this is confirmed in Micah 5, verse 6. We don't have it up there because it's from the review. In Micah 5:6, it says, they will waste with the sword the land of Assyria and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. So it calls Assyria there the land of Nimrod, just like Genesis chapter 10 does. So I think that Asher built it first and named it Nineveh, but when Nimrod took over, he made it bigger. It appears that Nimrod was a satanic figure in the Bible, and many rabbis consider him to be one of the first antichrists because he directly opposes God's will in every way. So seeing how famous and powerful Nimrod became, many people have tried to find him in the lists of kings or among the gods of the ancient religions. The best option I've seen is Sargon of Akkad. And in fact, in Genesis 10, it says that Nimrod built Akkad. So that also makes sense. Also, what we know of Sargon is that he first owned southern Mesopotamia, but for some reason he left it and went north and conquered all the way to Nineveh. And another reason to think it could be Sargon is that many of ancient artworks that show Sargon show him brutally killing people. Not just animals, but soldiers, hacking them apart. That's exactly what the Assyrian Empire became famous for. So maybe Sargon is the real name of Nimrod. Henry Morris, he suggests that the list in Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, only lists the descendants of Noah who were physically present at the Tower of Babel. That's the chapter 11 topic. So in other words, some of the godly tribes went out and aren't in the list because they did what God wanted. They already spread and filled the earth as they were supposed to. And that's implied perhaps 3 times in chapter 10. It says something like this. These were the sons of Shem, or Ham, or Japheth, according to their families, according to their languages in their lands, according to their nations. So in other words, all the nations that got different languages were the guys who were at Babel. The guys who did what they were supposed to do and went out early, they didn't get their languages changed. So it's therefore possible that many peoples who have interesting proximities in their languages across the continent, perhaps they had left before the Tower of Babel, and thus their languages are similar. It's also interesting that Answers in Genesis says or maybe it was a book that I read about the Tower of Babel, that there are approximately 78 different languages, not counting dialects, but 78 languages. And that's pretty close to the 70 nations listed in Genesis chapter 10. Very close. So that ends the review. Now we're starting with Genesis 11, verses 1 through 4. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad the face of the whole earth." Now, there are a lot of skeptics and clueless people who make a big deal out of the fact that Genesis 10 says that the sons of Noah and their descendants spread throughout the world and had many different languages. But then we come to Genesis 11, and suddenly the whole earth has one language and one speech. So obviously the Bible's a contradiction. Genesis 10 says they're everywhere with languages. Genesis 11 says they're all in one place. You have to be stupid to believe that that's the problem. I mean, it's obvious that Genesis 10 is a list of how the nations came to be, and Genesis 11 now tells us the story about why they split up. So it's the same problem you have back in Genesis 1 and 2. They say there's two creation stories and they're totally different. No, Genesis 1 is sort of a summary of how he did it, and Genesis 2 gives some more details about day 6. That's the only difference. So that's not a contradiction. So these people decided to all stick together and move together into the plain of Shinar, which is south and east of Ararat, after Noah had landed. Technically, this is all the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So it could go all the way from Syria down to the Persian Gulf, including Babylon and southern Mesopotamia. Remember that in the list of the cities Nimrod built, it starts in the very south and it works its way north. And that's one reason we believe that the Tower of Babel was probably not in Babylon as we know it, modern Babylon, because modern Babylon's about 150 miles north of southern Mesopotamia. So we'll get to that location later. The word Babel means confusion in Hebrew, but the Babylonians themselves didn't like that name. They claim that it means the gateway to God, which is actually another interesting parallel to the Tower of Babel. It sounds kind of like what they wanted to do is build a gate to God, but Hebrew calls it confusion. Now, I read a pretty good book this week about the Tower of Babel. It's by Bodhi Hodge, who is from Answers in Genesis. And I'll refer to it a fair bit, although I do disagree with him on a couple of little points, especially regarding Nimrod, because he seems to think that Nimrod was a good guy. And he has 3 reasons. One, he says there's no proof that Nimrod built Babel because it never names him. Well, that's an argument from silence. So it's true that it doesn't say that, but I think the inferences show that he did. Second, he says that even if Nimrod built Babel, clearly the people all agreed with him and wanted to build it. So he wasn't a tyrant, even if he did build it. Okay, yeah, well, they're all wrong. Is it a contradiction that I say that Nimrod was a tyrant and killed lots of people, but when they built the city, they all agreed? No, it just means that all the people who disagreed were dead. I mean, or left or whatever. And it also can mean, if you think about charismatic dictators, they are able to persuade people to do things. When you think of people like Hitler, Hitler was a very charismatic individual. He got, if you watch his speeches, very excitable speeches and gets people excited. Many satanic people have the ability to persuade. They are great deceivers. And so it's quite possible that people who already wanted to stay and make a name for themselves and live together in one big city or in one big region, of course they want to do what they want, but the leader wants them to do it too and encourages them. And Bodhi Hodge's 3rd reason for thinking that Nimrod was not a bad guy is because he built so many cities all over. That proves that he was obeying God and spreading out over the earth. I think that's nonsense. What it says is that they wanted to stay in the land of Shinar. It's not that they were all going to live around the tower, the whole population of the earth. No, he's building cities all in this region between the 2 rivers. That's all his land. So that's not spreading across the world. I think he's misreading that. But still, it's a very good book. All of these cities are within 200 miles of each other. And if the whole world's population is going to live within 200 miles of each other, that's not God's plan. But one of the most interesting questions is, why did they decide to build a tower and a city? Cities are for protection and for economics. You want to have a city because you can be safe and protect against raiders, but also you've got trade and things going on in there. But a tower is different. A tower usually implies fear. Most towers are built for seeing far away. They're for surveillance and watching. When you build towers along walls of cities, they're so you can shoot down on your enemies and so you can see them far away. And the word in Hebrew for tower is migdal, and migdal is a watchtower for seeing enemies in the distance. So, of course, there's nothing wrong with being safe and watching for enemies. But this tower does not seem to have been built for watching out for enemies. Nimrod had unified all the people there. There were no enemies nearby. Unless he feared that the Shemites from Iran would attack, but that's not what the people say either. Rabbi Baya suggests that after the flood, the descendants of Noah were afraid of another flood. And since they didn't believe God's promise, the ambitious rulers used fear to gain power and build the cities and the tower. And the ancient Jews claim that the purpose of the tower was to save thousands of people by they could climb up if there was a flood. Now, there's a number of silly reasons to disbelieve that idea. And it's not just that it could save thousands of people. Well, what about the other 50,000 who are going to die below? But here's the problems with that. Where did they build the tower? In a valley. If you're going to build a tower to save you from a flood, you're going to build it on a mountain. And it's not that far away to the nearest mountain, 50 miles or something. Put the tower there if that's the purpose. Another thing the Hebrews say is that perhaps it was, this is a funny one, I think. They had thousands of shovels, and the thousands of people would go to the top of the tower and dig holes in the clouds to make the rain fall out so that there wouldn't be any more floods. If you poke holes in the clouds and get the rain to fall, gradually you won't have a flood. That doesn't sound like a real great idea. Also, the whole flood thing is a bad idea because they build it out of mud bricks. Now they fire them, so they're a little harder, but mud bricks dissolve in water. So if there's a flood, the tower's just going to go like a sandcastle. So no, it was not built to survive a flood or another flood. Perhaps they were building the tower to try to recreate the mountain on which God lived above Eden. If you remember, there was a mountain that Jesus came down from where his throne was, and where you remember in Ezekiel 28 talks about Satan living there, the dragon living on the mountain of God over Eden. But it's hard to see why rebels who hate God want to meet God. So I don't think they were trying to meet God with their tower. They're trying to avoid doing what he says. Yes. Well, for one thing, they don't have a lot of stones in the area. The Babylon plain is mostly dirt and mud. So that's one reason they used bricks. But yes, I believe that is one of the reasons why God later demands that altars be built out of stones and not handmade materials, because he doesn't want humans dealing with his holy places. So yes, it is entirely a man-made thing, the bricks that they use. So we get the answer, though, in verse 4. Why the people built the tower? They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So what the people believe is that if they build this tall tower, they will become famous, and it will help unify them from scattering over the earth. So they're consciously looking for a way not to do what God wants. And that is an intentional rebellion, and why their leader is named Nimrod, because he's the chief rebel. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the rebels use God's own style of speech. Do you remember what he said when he created man? Let us make man in our image. And what do these people say? Let us build for ourselves a city. Let us make for ourselves a name. They're basically saying, we're in charge now. God's not in charge. We're going to do what we want to do. And they even copied God's own words. They're now their own gods, deciding what to do to oppose God. Now, Henry Morris points out that the phrase they use, they wanted a tower whose top is in the heavens. That's not the literal form. It's another translation choice. Literally, it says, the tower is meant to be heaven or represent heaven. In other words, this is our God. This is our giant altar to worship what we want. And we're basically going to worship ourselves. This is secular humanism at its finest. So what they're saying is, let us build a tower to make us our own gods. We will no longer have to answer to anyone. Yes, it's a huge amount of pride. They're going to oppose God, and they're sure they can get away with it by building a big tower. So God had not commanded this. Even if it was, it's possible that Nimrod said, hey, we could worship God if we built a giant tower. And the closer you are to God, the more better the worship is, right? But even if that was true, God didn't command that. God didn't command him to build a tower to worship him from. He commanded them to spread over the earth. So either way, they're disobeying God. So Nimrod was one of the first antichrists leading people against the rule of God. Now, to make a name for ourselves, it might imply idolatry. It could imply that they wanted Nimrod to be the king over all the earth as their god. Reverend Hirsch writes that the crime was seeking glory for themselves. And that's a worse kind of idolatry even than worshiping stones and rocks and wood. You want glory for yourself. The purpose of man, what's the chief end of man? Yeah, so they're purposely avoiding their chief purpose. They're purposely changing it. Now my chief purpose is to glorify myself. It's kind of like the guys that Luke talks about, or Jesus talks about in Luke 12. Now, interestingly, we'll talk about what the tower looked like. Now, probably if you've seen artworks of the Tower of Babel, they look a lot to me like the Tower of Pisa, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, only it's not leaning. They're very small, narrow, round towers. But that technology was not available to people then. You have to have metal and rebar and concrete and things like that. They didn't have that at this time. The Romans invented concrete, but that's 2,000 years later. So you can't build small structures with that much weight on one small spot. You've got to spread the weight out in the ancient world. So they built ziggurats. A ziggurat is a form of a pyramid. A pyramid is slightly more straight-edged, diagonal. A ziggurat is called a step pyramid because it goes up in steps. And we find these throughout Mesopotamia, all the way down in the Persian Gulf, sunken in the water even. It's only later that the Egyptians started smoothing the edges like the Great Pyramid of Giza using limestone that could be easily shaped around the blocks. Now, ziggurats, surprisingly enough, there are more ziggurats in the Americas, in Central and South America, 2 or 3 times more than all of Europe and Africa and Asia combined. So we'll talk about that a little bit because that's really interesting. But the archaeologists have it backwards. They claim that the pyramids in Egypt were built in 2500 BC. Well, it's not too far off, but we believe the flood was about 2400 BC. So what I would say is the Tower of Babel was around 2300 BC, and then the pyramids were soon after, because the people who left Babel went to Egypt and they built their own, only they added a little corners to it. So I just think they've got it backwards. But there are so many towers in the Americas. They were built by the Mayans and the Toltecs and the Aztecs. And they were built everywhere for worshiping gods and as tombs. Now, I find it intriguing that the children of Ham continued to build towers and temples long after Nimrod quit. They seemed to like what he was doing. Whereas the Shemites and the Japhethites didn't build many ziggurats. It seems to be mostly the Hamites. For instance, all the ones built in Babylon were built by Nimrod, probably. And then when they moved to Assyria, they built some there too. But the Shemites and the Japhethites didn't do that. They didn't build towers. The seed of the serpent has a thing about high places. Maybe that's why God forbade worship from high places throughout the Old Testament. You see throughout Joshua, there's some pulling up. Not sure who it is. But anyway, you see throughout the Old Testament, do not build high places. And they did it anyway. They thought that the closer your altar was to God, the closer you were to God. But God said no. God wanted his altars to be low and humble. You remember, he even said, you won't even put them on a pedestal because then I'll see your nakedness when you climb up on the stairs. He likes his altars down low. And of course, he also likes his altars built of unhewn stones. You just pile up rocks and put some mortar in. That's it. He doesn't want bricks. I do not believe that the Tower of Babel was in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, but many people do. But I do suspect that it looked very much similar, because if it was Nimrod's people who built them, they would, of course, all look kind of similar. There was actually a person who visited Babylon and wrote down an account of what the temple looked like in Babylon. His name was Herodotus. He was a Greek historian about 400 BC. And he saw it in the days of shortly after Nebuchadnezzar. And here's what he said about it. The temple of Bel, that's the Babylonian Zeus, was still existence in my time. It has a solid central tower, 1 stadium square, and a second erected on top of it, and then a third, and so on up to 8. All 8 towers can be climbed by a spiral way running around the outside, and about halfway up there are seats for those to rest on who are ascending. At the summit of the topmost tower stands a great temple with a fine large couch on it, richly covered, and a golden table beside it. The shrine contains no images, and no one spends the night there except, if you believe the Chaldeans, who are the priests of Bel, one Babylonian woman all alone, whom it may be that the god has chosen. And the Chaldeans also say that though I do not believe it, that the god comes to the temple in person and rests with her on the bed. So this is that sex theory that perhaps just like Nimrod did with his wife on top of the tower, every night a Babylonian woman's supposed to stay up there just in case the god shows up and might have a child with her and make more giants, I guess. I don't know. So that's from Herodotus, about 400 BC. But what that tells you, though, the details are interesting. There are 8 stages to the top. And there's a scholar named Heinberg. He wrote a book on ancient legends of history about paradise. And he says that the Babylonians used 7-step pyramids and painted each level a different color of the rainbow, so that the priests climbing it were metaphorically climbing up to the gods on the bridge. The rainbow was considered the bridge to the gods, or the gate of the gods by the Babylonians. So the bottom 7 levels were painted like rainbow colors, and the top part was shiny like the sun. So some Babylonians claimed that this was the original Tower of Babel, and that Nimrod was Baal. But others said that Nimrod was Marduk, another god of Babylon. Nimrod might have married Queen Semiramis and produced giants. So it might have been an idolatrous temple to Nimrod himself and his wife. But the Aztecs and the Mayans, I told you they built lots of these towers. The Aztec, one of their legends of the Aztecs and Mayans is that a giant built the tower, but the gods destroyed his workers. And so from then on, it was a place of worship to the great flying green dragon called Quetzalcoatl. You've ever heard of the myth of Quetzalcoatl in South America? A flying dragon. So it's interesting that the Mayans claimed that it was built by a giant, the gods killed his workers, and then it was worshiping the great dragon. That sounds a lot like Satan. But soon after Herodotus saw this temple in Babylon, it was in a state of collapse. It was starting to fall down. Mud bricks can only last so long, even if they're fired. And so the king Xerxes of Persia, who might have been the wife of or husband of Esther, demolished it. When Alexander the Great saw this giant empty spot in Babylon, he wanted to rebuild the temple to Bel, but he died and it was never rebuilt. So that was the last time it had been seen. Now, it is also possible that one purpose of the tower was astronomical or astrological. I'm not sure what I make of it. There are a number of Christian theologians who believe in a thing called the gospel in the stars. This was a big thing in the 1950s. You may have seen some little books about it, the gospel in the stars. The idea is based in Genesis chapter 1, where it says that God made the stars and the planets and the moon and the sun for signs and seasons. What does that mean, signs? Well, I took it to mean calendars, to make out the months and the weeks and the year. They take it to mean more than that. They believe that the stars were purposely set up by God in a pattern to show us constellations, and that the constellations made a story of 12 different stories, all leading to the gospel. In other words, the serpent, Draco, and the Savior, and all these things are in the stars, is what they claim. So the original 12 constellations were the gospel. But then once the Bible was written, those signs were not so important. And in the process of time, unfortunately, those constellations have been twisted into astrology, which is the devil's twisting of the good gospel in the stars. So they believe that all of these ancient zodiac temples and such were built for understanding the zodiac and for seeing the movements of the constellations and then predicting the future based on it. I do not believe in that at all. And neither do the Christian theologians who believe the gospel in the stars, just to point that out. But it is quite possible. If you think about it, Daniel in Babylon and the Magi, one of their expertises was the stars. They had viewers in temples in all over the known world at the time. And if they saw a planet do something strange or a comet or anything like that, an eclipse coming, they planned things on it. So anyway, it's possible that these temples, we have found that almost every temple has holes and guides to shine the light. So on a certain day of the year, the light shines on a certain holy spot. There, and Stonehenge apparently does something kind of like that. There's a number of places in the world that do that. And so it's possible that they were built for astronomy and astrology. So now we'll go to verses 5 through 9. In the first verses, they said they're going to build it, and they build it. Genesis 11, 5 through 9. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because the Lord there confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Now you know what the liberals are going to say about this. You can probably guess. God is obviously afraid of these people. They're so powerful now that they're unified. He's got to put a stop to this somehow. That's what the liberals say. This shows how primitive God was in Israel. He was worried about the people becoming too powerful, and he has to stop them. That's ridiculous. No, God wanted them to spread out and not be one giant empire ruling the world, especially an evil empire ruled by Satan and his man Nimrod. What he's saying is that the world could be just as evil as it had been under the Nephilim, especially if he is in fact producing giants. So God put a stop to their plans, but this time it was a non-violent plan for the most part. There was no flood, no annihilation, just a somewhat simple tweak to a part of their brains. You may have heard there is a brain problem that we occasionally get called aphasia. And it usually happens in coordination with a stroke, or if your brain doesn't get enough blood or oxygen. If your brain starts to starve, you start confusing your words. That's aphasia. What God did was kind of like that, but not exactly. Because it doesn't seem they were talking nonsense. They suddenly spoke in other languages. So it wasn't just confusion. It was confusion based on the fact that people were speaking different languages. And they probably could speak to others. It's not that God made every person there have a different language, because then there would be tens of thousands of new languages. No, apparently they were left in groups, perhaps their brothers and sisters and families, for the most part, all speaking the same language, because then they go off together and become a nation. So they obviously have the same language. Now, Peleg, if you remember, Peleg's name, we're told in Genesis that the division of the earth occurred in the days of Peleg. Peleg's name means to split up or divide. And it's interesting that there's another place where this word is used in Psalm 55:9. And it's used just the same as it is in Genesis chapter 10. I believe this is David. Yes, this is David asking God for help. And here's what he says. Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues, for I have seen violence and strife in the city. So David asks God for protection by God confusing their languages and dividing them. That's exactly the same as what happened in Genesis 10. So Peleg's name means to divide or separate. Now, one of the sons of Ham, named Put, he went to Libya in West Africa, as I told you. But it appears that some of his kids built boats and sailed to South America and formed the Olmec Empire, later to become the Mayans. And we believe this because the Olmecs and the Mayans use the same West African characters in their language as the West Africans do. So obviously, the Africans went to South America. And they also built ziggurats that are almost identical. So they have the same language and the same buildings as the Mayans and the Olmecs. Now, I read to you some months ago when we were in the flood, some Native American stories listed by an author named Liguri that shows he has over 200 ancient Indian legends and myths, Native Americans, from North, South, and Central America. But a few of those stories included stories about the Tower of Babel. So I want to mention a few of these to you. According to the Choctaw tribe, I believe the Choctaw are in Central and South United States, like Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana. But according to the Choctaw legend, the men of earth wanted to reach the sky, so they brought rocks and built a mound. But 3 days in a row, while they slept, a great wind came up and blew down the tower. But on the third day, the tower fell down, and then they suddenly spoke various languages and could not understand each other. So they began to fight with each other. Finally, they separated, scattering, some going north, some east, and others west, and they formed various tribes. And this explains why there are so many tribes. It's a Choctaw legend from hundreds of years ago. Now, the predecessors of the Aztecs were called the Toltecs. And in a history produced around 1605, a Spanish monk was told that after the flood, the men built a very high zacuali, which is a ziggurat. But in time, their languages were changed, and when they could not understand each other, the people scattered over the world. They also said that much later, there was one day when the sun stood still in its place for a whole day without moving, which confirms what we've been reading in Joshua in our Old Testament readings, the sun standing still for one day. So that comes from ancient Toltec legends. And it's interesting also that the word Toltec means crafty and wise. And in legend, they were great giant builders and craftsmen. So perhaps some of these giants came across from the sons of Cush by boat to South America and started building things and making their legends. One of the most interesting things, though, now to consider about the Tower of Babel comes 2,300 years later in Jerusalem. So turn over to Acts chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 1 through 13. You can look at this all as sort of an application of the Tower of Babel. Acts 2, verses 1 to 13. When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven like a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then there appeared on them divided tongues as of fire, and one sat on each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. And there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused. Interesting word. Because everyone heard them speak in his own language. Then they were all amazed and marveled, saying to each other, "Look, are not all these who speak Galileans? How is it that we hear in our own languages in which we were born? Parthians and Medes and Elamites, and those dwelling in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya, adjoining Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them speaking in our own tongues the wonderful works of God." So they were all amazed and perplexed and said to each other, "What could this mean?" And others mocked and said, "They're full of wine." Okay, so that's the end of the reading. But then Peter says, no, they're not drunk. They're filled with the Holy Spirit. And he quotes Joel. He says that this is the beginning of the new covenant, as Joel said, on the great and powerful day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And at the end of his sermon, Peter adds this verse in verse 39. For the promise is to you and your children, and to all who are afar off, as many as the Lord our God will call. So, think about this all together. After the flood, humans rebel against God, and he scatters them over the earth with a confusion of languages. Perhaps they thought that the Tower of Babel was their version of the ark, that it could protect them against God's judgment. And in Daniel chapter 5, there's a similar event. In the wicked Babylonian king's palace, a ghostly hand writes words on the wall, and everyone freaks out, and no one can understand the strange message. But Daniel comes in and interprets it and says, your evil kingdom is coming to an immediate end, and a new empire is coming, taking over. And now, 500 years later, the prophecy of Daniel is fulfilled, that the old empire is being swept away and a new empire is coming, and it will be built out of a rock not made with human hands. It will take over the whole earth. So when Jesus ascends into heaven, he sends the Holy Spirit with the message of the new covenant, and they all hear it in their own languages, and they can take it home for their families for salvation. Now, Pentecost fell on the first day of a new week. That is a Sunday. It signified a new start. And this Pentecost was especially important. The church becomes the true ark of God for salvation. The church is God's building. And as Paul says, or Peter says, we are all living stones within it. So Jesus starts sending apostles out like Paul and Barnabas to bring the good news to all the nations who don't come to Jerusalem. And Gentiles begin joining the kingdom of God. So in other words, this is a reversal of the Tower of Babel. No longer will there be a confusion of languages. Although there are still many languages, they can all hear and learn the gospel and be saved in spite of the language barrier. And then they can teach it in their own tongues. So the Messiah, the seed of the woman, the seed of Shem, reverses the curse of Babel with a blessing promised to all the nations. Just as the festival of bulls had 70 bulls sacrificed on behalf of the 70 nations in Genesis 10, now the Messiah has stopped all sacrifice and sacrifices himself to bless the nations and overturn the curse of Babel. And in 70 AD, God finalizes this. He destroys Jerusalem and again scatters the people. But this time he scatters the Jews because they rejected the Messiah. The apostles go forth and preach and teach. Many Christians only scattered under persecution under the Jews and Romans, so they unwillingly scattered, and God used that to spread his church. But the Jews were scattered in judgment like the Tower of Babel. Now, hopefully there will be some restoration for them as a country before the end. But when the kingdom is completed in the future, it is prophesied that we will all return again to one language. So turn over to Zephaniah chapter 3. This appears to be a promise for the new earth after the judgment day. Book we don't go to very often, Zephaniah 3, verses 9 through 13. For then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they all may call on the name of the Lord, to serve him with one accord. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshipers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. In that day you will not be ashamed for any of your deeds in which you transgress against me. Then I will take away from your midst those who rejoice in your pride, and you will no longer be haughty in my holy mountain. I will leave in your midst a meek and humble people, and they will trust in the name of the Lord. The remnant of Israel will do no unrighteousness and speak no lies, nor shall any deceitful tongue be found in their mouths, for they shall feed their flocks and lie down, and no one will make them afraid. Now, once again, you can see that in the book of Genesis, that's the opening scene. The whole book of Genesis is the opening scene for the Bible. It shows all the disasters that befell humanity because of their sin. Sin, murder, flood, tyranny, scattering, and confusion all appear in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But then the Gospels of Jesus the Messiah come thousands of years later. Jesus is the healer and the restorer. He conquers sickness, prejudice, false teaching, demons, and false doctrines. His new kingdom brings truth, love, and unity. And he sends out his people to all the nations to bring the gospel and convert those whom were given to the Son as his growing flock. So when the time of right is right, Jesus will conquer the last remnants of evil in humans and demons, and he will purify the universe from its enslavement to sin, and he will put his children from every nation into one place with one common language forever. In other words, the scattering will be completely reversed, the gathering will be complete, and creation will be completely restored. So that is the reverse of the Tower of Babel. Are there any questions or comments about all of that?
The table of nations is supposed to be the nations that resulted from the scattering of the Tower of Babel. How is it that all three lines of Noah are represented in those nations if it was the line of Ham that built the Tower of Babel?
It's a good question. The question then comes back to Henry Morris's interpretation that the only nations listed in Genesis 10 were the ones who were scattered from Babel. It's possible that he's incorrect, because that is a good point.
Because has the line of Shem, and it mentions Peleg, who was
From the line of Shem.
forefather of Abram, and we know Abram is.
Oh, right. Well, I think what it's saying though is not that it's not, even though Shem is the seed of the woman and the Messiah will come from Shem, it does not mean that there will not be people from all the nations who are saved.
I'm just saying, if they all came from the Tower of Babel, then all three lines would have had to at some point be bad, or at least together, which doesn't make sense.
Some representatives from all three were there, yes. So even some Japhethites. But it's possible that Henry Morris is not correct, and maybe everyone was disobeying. It's possible.
I think that's more it, is that it gets back to your evil men and we're at enmity with God.
Right.
I mean, it clearly says here, we've been told twice now, once in the garden, and once after the flood, subdue the earth,
Right.
scatter about, be fruitful, multiply. And instead, man comes right out and says, who stops it? Let us make the name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the earth. Man's rebelling against God. God said, no, it's not my plan for you, like you said. I'm gonna scare you, I'm gonna shoot you out. That's, it doesn't matter what line you come from, we are all speaking the same language there. Now we're pushing you out, and in an instant, everybody's confused. Everybody's got complete languages in their head that they don't understand.
Right. Yeah. If I remember correctly, yeah, it was Henry Morris. He thinks that Romans chapter 1, the progression of evil, is based on the Tower of Babel. If you remember that passage in the end of Romans chapter 1. But yes, all humans are born evil. We're all born the seed of the serpent, and we're only transformed by the Holy Spirit to become the seed of the woman. It's a very interesting passage. I had heard that comparison to Pentecost before, but never really looked at it. And I think it's also interesting that it even throws in the word confusion. They were all confused about what was going on. They were all babbled.
That's interesting at that point too, because you have a bunch of different men listening to one person and hearing it in several different languages. It's not this guy's talking different languages, it's that they're understanding what he's saying.
Well, although it also sounds like it was more than one person speaking. So perhaps Peter was the main speaker and perhaps the other apostles were speaking too in the other languages. There was more than one speaker, but Peter was the main one. Maybe they were translating sort of. In fact, that's what the whole idea of tongues is in the New Testament. You're supposed to have a translator. They did. All right, well, next week we will talk about we're going to start talking about the Ice Age because we think that that's starting to occur now and will become worse. We think that the Ice Age lasts for 500 years or so after the flood. So it started getting colder after the flood, but we'll get to that later next week. Hopefully it got all that. Yeah, it says it's still going. So for some reason, occasionally it pops up with this little message saying you lost your internet connection, but it keeps ticking. I don't know what